I sometimes get asked how could I possibly, quote, believe in UFOs. But rather than just believing, which implies an absence of objectivity and not a process of discovery, it's a fact that sometimes we cannot readily identify what we see in the sky. Still, there are many who continue to think this topic is absurd, claiming that by acknowledging the data at all, that one is also claiming UFOs are, quote, aliens.
So there are a myriad of UFO nuts out there who are going to tell me that I'm closed-minded for not believing the rather outrageous claim that Earth is being visited by aliens.
I'm not saying they're aliens. I'm just interested in looking at the data, which is precisely what we'll be doing here. What you're about to see is the most famous UFO event in the world, and one that I think is significant, but some skeptics disagree. Let's see what you think.
Turned a lot of heads, made worldwide news, and then it was denied.
It is the most famous UFO sighting in the world.
What many aren't aware of is that 2 years before the Phoenix Lights, Dr. Lynn Kitai noticed something unusual outside her window.
In 1995, both my husband and I witnessed 3 amber orbs in a triangle formation, one on top and 2 closely aligned underneath, very close to our home, about 100 yards from our home. It was startling, and it was amazing at the same time.
2 years passed, with Dr. Lynn noticing nothing in the sky coming close to resembling what she previously saw, until a month and a half before the Phoenix Lights event, and she saw them again and recorded it.
January 22nd, 1997, I noticed 3 amber orbs now at a distance far west on the horizon. And I get an operator on the phone and I said, quick, you gotta get somebody out there. There's some strange lights in front of South Mountain. As I finish my sentence, they're gone.
Dr. Lynn then picks up her phone to call the Arizona Republic to get information on the lights.
The operator got off, she got right back on. She said, nope, nobody called. Well, I know I called.
The next morning, she calls the Arizona Republic again, but instead of asking them about the origin of the, quote, orbs, she asks if they received any calls last night in regards to the lights. The operator pled ignorance and directed Lynn's inquiry to Luke Air Force Base, but after briefly speaking with a critical lieutenant who claimed they had nothing to do with it, they directed her to the airport, who said the following.
He said, actually, there were 3 at 8 o'clock. They looked on radar. They didn't show up on radar. The 3 disappeared. After he picked up binoculars to look, it was that unusual. They were 6 points of light that seemed to be attached to something, but they couldn't see what it was attached to. Slowly moving in synchrony, as he put it. So I said, well, where were they? And there was silence. And finally he says, beats me.
Reported at 6:55 p.m., a man in Henderson, Nevada witnessed an object in the shape of a V with 6 large lights pass over him from the northwest. 8:15 p.m., former police officer Tom Chavez witnessed a cluster of 5 orange lights, consisting of 4 lights together with a 5th light seemingly trailing the other 4.
They didn't glare. They did not emit like a beam, like a floodlight, like landing aircraft land. There seemed to be some depth to them.
Calls began to flood police stations and media offices across multiple districts, including Chino Valley, Prescott Valley, Dewey, Cords Junction, Wickenburg, Cave Creek, and many other communities to the north and west of Phoenix. Then, this happened.
Wait, where? There's another one too. Where? Oh, look at that. There's another one. No, we're just excited. We're not. They keep coming. Wait, look at them.
I got that one.
But what some misunderstand is this video shows the second event. The majority of sightings actually occurred before this in the state of Nevada and Arizona. The Public Affairs Office at Luke Air Force Base announced that their personnel had investigated these lights, establishing they were flares launched from an A-10 Warthog. But miles of controversy exists over this claim, so much so that 3 years after the sighting, the Arizona National Guard staged a demonstration to quell the claims made from those who kept saying what they saw was not flares. Judge for yourself in this side-by-side comparison. ultimately, whether we're looking at flares or not, holds no bearing on the thousands of sightings that happened previously, reporting a V-shaped craft moving slowly and quietly through the entire state of Arizona. This leads many to claim three possibilities in regards to these lights. One being that they are not flares. Two being if they are flares, it's simply a random coincidence of timing. Or three, someone was likely instructed to do it on purpose in order to provide an explanation for this.
We were telling ourselves not to blink.
It was very close to the ground. It was just like floating over the housetops.
The first thing that struck me is that they were just in a V-shaped formation. Well, it's at night, and guys wouldn't have been flying in a V-shaped formation, in a VIC. We'd call it a VIC. So now I'm looking at 5 lights passing overhead silently at a very slow rate. And it also occurred to me that they were flying too slow to stay in the air if it was an aircraft.
It must have been around 10-ish. And I'm looking off towards the north. Coming in directly at me are these 3 enormous lights, and they're moving incredibly slow.
When somebody in our group said, "Oh my gosh, what is that up above?" we all looked up at the same time and saw this amazing, huge, dark, silent object.
My emotion was that of just kind of wonderment and trying to figure out, what am I looking at? What am I seeing here?
Purportedly, the craft moved south across the entire state of Arizona. Witnesses claim whatever it was totally quiet.
There was absolutely no sound at all.
Just 3 beautiful lights coming towards us. And it seemed to move effortlessly, just glided right over.
This was one solid object, one craft, one big, large boomerang.
Everybody that called me said the same thing. It was huge, it was slow, it was low, it was totally silent. They could see some lights, somewhere between 5 and 9 lights on it at any given time.
Claiming the lights had abnormal characteristics.
It was an orangish amber light, and it was so rich and lustrous, it's almost as if the objects seemed to be comprised of the light itself.
They were more like glowing, gaseous globes.
There's no flaring. They're like a ball. On the video, they flicker, they're white, they're much smaller. But nonetheless, the formations themselves are compelling.
When it got directly over my head, and I mean, I'm talking dead center here, I was right underneath this thing. It was like there was no filament in this thing. They appear to be in a canister. There was light swimming around in this shape or form.
And they weren't beaming down like landing lights. They were just big balls of light, but very pretty.
And the craft was said to be massive, with some gauging it to be more than a mile wide.
We could not see the whole object from front to back, from side to side. It was so big.
I would gauge this object to be several football fields. I mean, like a mile, maybe more than a mile, maybe even 2 miles. It was huge.
I put my hand up to where the nose of the craft was, and I took my other arm out to where the end of the wing was, and it was well over 30 inches. And I said to my wife at the time, I said, that's a mile long.
It was coming over the mountain, and it was like almost as wide as one of the humps. And it was very low.
It's coming across the sky, and as it's moving, it's blocking and unblocking the stars. There is actually a shape.
The object we saw, if we opened up a newspaper, you could not block out the object that we saw.
It's one of the biggest things I've ever seen that moved like that. I mean, it was just enormous.
There was like a light grid. It was almost dancing to a beat. Dim light, almost shadow behind. I wouldn't say that it was intense, but it was definitely profound.
When you look down the street on a hot day in Phoenix, above the street's like, it's really wavy, and you see everything kind of distorted, and that's what it looked like up inside the middle of the craft.
It was just gliding, and then it stopped, and then it like, the sides retracted a little, and then it was gone.
Just went.
Acceleration to deceleration, it was no noise the whole time.
And not a sound.
So how about we work together and try to figure out what this thing is?
Even after thousands of calls to city officials from citizens requesting answers of just what happened, no explanation came. Then after a few months, the governor at the time, Fife Symington, finally, on June 19th, made a statement.
And now I'll ask Officer Stein and his colleagues to escort the accused into the room so that we may all look upon the guilty party. Don't get him too close to me, please. This just goes to show that you guys are entirely too serious.
But eventually, he explained why he felt the need to make light of March 13th.
People coming into my office saying this thing is just reaching heights of hysteria and concern. And so three of us sort of sat down at the end and decided to try to lighten the mood a little bit.
He then, after being retired for some time, opened up about his experience witnessing the first event.
I told Ann what I was doing. I was going to go up to Squaw Peak and see what everybody was, clamoring about.
If you had been here 10 years ago and standing out here and looking up there at the lights and the view, you would have been astounded. You would have been amazed.
But that was total bunk. Those I've seen high altitude flares before. I mean, that wasn't. They weren't flares.
And when I walked in the front door, she looked at me, and I was apparently normally I'm fair complected and pale anyway, right? And she said, "Oh my gosh," she said, "she looked like a ghost."
I still, behind the scenes, tried to investigate it, but I got nowhere.
There were the sightings of the America West plane coming into Sky Harbor, said he could have landed on it.
It was enormous, like an aircraft carrier in the sky. Is that about as close as
I think that's a fair description.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
In your gut, you could just tell it was otherworldly.
What did you see? And I said, well, I don't know what I saw, but it was really something, and I'm not going to talk about it.
Once I realized how large it was, it just faded off into the night just quite quickly. I wanted it to last longer. I wanted to see more of it. It just went away.
According to director of Skeptoid.com Brian Dunning, all eyewitness accounts should be approached with a shrug, claiming that the Phoenix lights were flares. Deal with it. Dunning continues, saying the Phoenix lights fall well within the wide range of brightness that's possible from LUU-2 illumination flares at 70 miles. And as was said before, the Air Force Base did claim responsibility for the Phoenix lights, as stated here by Captain Drew Sullins.
And they were dropping high-intensity flares that deploy on a little parachute and descend to the Earth. And we think that those flares were mistakenly called UFOs by the folks in the valley in Phoenix there.
Again, even if they were flares, they were dropped in a completely different location than was reported by eyewitnesses, spanning over 400 miles from Henderson, Nevada to Tucson, Arizona. The media at the time breezed over this fact entirely and only focused on this video in Phoenix. If, as some claim, the military deployed these flares so they could use them as an explanation for the first event, it worked beautifully. Because once the military claimed responsibility, that was all the public and the media needed to put the matter to rest, remaining ignorant of everything else that occurred before it. Depending on your biases, it's either easy or difficult to say what this video shows. What's undeniable, however, is that fundamentally it's a red herring, distracting from the first event. Because receiving one call of a V-shaped silent craft is odd. Receiving thousands is something else entirely.
To fly a craft, it wasn't even flying. How could something fly, be lifted by air, going that slow? Not possible.
It was huge, and it was at least a mile or two in diameter. I mean, the fucking thing was ginormous.
I saw 6 lights over the airport in absolute uniform in a V shape.
At the time, there was this house that was being constructed up on the hill, and there was a telephone pole, and the craft flew like right over the top.
Well, I saw a huge craft just kind of come right over Squaw Peak. That was, it was just breathtaking.
I mean, and it was silent. It made no noise.
There was no sound. Like, even in the neighborhood was really quiet.
He's actually out in the street running after this thing. That's how slow it was going. The kids thought it was going about 10 or 15 miles an hour.
Everybody said, look at that. And we turned around, and this thing was coming from the northwest, traveling to the southeast.
Shaped, what I said at the time was like a carpenter square. It looked like a flying carpenter square.
Very interesting part looking back on it, and I especially was very very intrigued and excited with the idea that this is something miraculous that's happening right now.
Absolutely perfect, under control, powerful, smooth, quiet.
And Tim and I were looking up into the light wells. I mean, these were circular light wells that we could not even estimate really how deep they were.
People approximately witnessed this, one of the largest experiences of this sort ever recorded.
The Phoenix Lights phenomena didn't seem to be falsifiable in any way. It was being validated by most everybody that saw it.
The entire object, it was a massive black object traveling very slow without any noise over I-10 on the Birch 15 right around 8:30.
Who knows where it came from? Inexplicable.
And it just kept going over our heads and going and going and going, and it seemed like we could actually just reach up and touch it.
It didn't make a sound. That's the point. It was there. We saw it. There's no doubt in our minds whatsoever what we saw.
Although it's difficult to believe, what happened next was arguably even more surprising.
So I went into the meeting and I said there were these reporters, the reporter outside, and had asked some questions about these lights that went over Phoenix last March 13th, and could we find out what it was?
The council completely ignored her request for inquiry into the lights, and after the session ended, an assistant city manager walked up to Frances, telling her she shouldn't have asked that question. As word got out that a local councilwoman was curious about the Phoenix Lights, she was mocked by the press. But as a result of her new exposure, thousands of calls flooded her office and home with people wishing to speak with her about their experience of the event. Frances Barwood became the go-to person for the public to give information to regarding the Phoenix Lights. She received a phone call from a man named Richard Curtis, a man who claimed he was a disabled veteran and high-end videographer, who said he had video that showed the outline of the craft in detail.
But from what he said, his video showed an outline of the craft because the city lights reflected up. And he said too, it was murky, but he could see the outline. He was so excited, I really didn't want to push him on much of anything. So I told him, could you make a copy?
But after 2 weeks, Richard called her back to ask what she thought of the video.
And he called me at home again, and he asked what I thought of the video. I said I never got it. And when did he send it? He said he didn't, but was going to get copies made. He was on the way to get copies made when 2 men turned up at his door, and they said that they came for the videos for Barwood. He asked them, "Are you from her office?" And they said yes. And I said to him, "Well, I don't have any men in my office. I just had 3 women." They told him they were going to bring back his original because he hadn't made the copies yet.
Frances went back into her old recordings and was able to get Richard's address from it. Her friends went to Richard's address, and as it turns out, the characteristics and hobbies he stated checked out.
Richard did live at the Westwood Hole. He was a disabled veteran. He did have professional CB and video equipment. And then it got more interesting. The manager of the hotel saw a black car pull up, and 2 men in 3-piece black suits got out, and both were wearing hats and sunglasses, and they went into the hotel, and he said they looked identical. And then the next person who saw him was the minister who counseled with the residents at the hotel, and they asked him where Richard Curtis's apartment was, and went up. Neither of them remember them coming down or leaving, but the car was gone. The last I heard, they changed his medication, and he had a bad reaction, and he was taken away, and nobody knows where he is now.
Later on, Frances started to notice that her phone was acting up and called the phone company to see what was wrong with it.
And he checked inside, then he went outside and he checked along the line. And when he came back, he would not come in the house. And went to the window and he said, I want to tell you that there is a tap on your line, but it's not local, it's in the central office, which means it's government. And you didn't hear that from me. And he did not want to come in the house at all, and he left.
Many UFO events seem to habitually occupy certain themes of secrecy and awe. There's something to them that I think is significant and worth paying attention to, because just what the hell happened that night in Arizona? And if Francis's story is true, why did two men in black suits find the video and take it? And who were the people who bugged her phone? And if the military did deploy the flares, why do something like that while the entire state is already in a frenzy? Is the craft, as some claim, a secret government project? And if it is, why fly it over Phoenix? And who was inside of it? I have no idea how to answer those questions. To call this case mysterious really is an understatement, and what I would have given to have been there and seen it for myself, whether I'd been unimpressed or completely transfixed, remains to be seen. What's certain is that an agnostic battle of skepticism versus openness fights inside my mind about all this stuff. I simply cannot claim to know something I don't know about, but I simultaneously am in awe of the witnesses' statements. The only place I can rightfully stand is in the showing, which is why I've shown all this to you. So where do you stand among all of this stuff